I'm looking around the room, and my guess is that not too many of you remember the 1950s firsthand. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri in the early 50s. I was a kid then. And there was a huge atomic energy commission plant in Kansas City. And we boys all knew we were target zero in case a war happened. We didn't even know the term arms race or Cold War, but we knew they made atom bombs over here, which wasn't really true, but we thought it was. And we thought, geez, how long are we going to be around? We didn't know. Now, the point of my talk is that arms race is long gone, Cold War is long gone, but we may be drifting into another arms race, and at this time it would be a space arms race. And it has some pretty important implications, and yet the whole business is flying beneath the radar. Hardly anybody knows about it. I'm not going to talk about ballistic missile defense here. That's an old story. That's been debated for 30 years, 40 years. We're talking about something new. Now, I'm going to give a little background. There are four strands of thought here I want to follow. One has to do with President Eisenhower. One has to do with a precision war, the new American way of precision war. One has to do with space control and its antecedents. And perhaps most important, American exceptionalism, the idea that America, because of its divine purpose or civic virtue or whatever, can operate any way it feels on the world stage. The first thing is Eisenhower. I don't know how many of you have studied Eisenhower very deeply. I'm a Democrat. I always thought he was a pretty poor president. But when I began doing research for the book, I began to appreciate that he had a lot more wisdom and foresight than many people of his age. He established a Space for Peaceful Purposes policy in 1955. It wasn't a fully fleshed out policy, but it was there. The kernel was there. After Sputnik, there was a huge outcry on editorial pages, in the military, at think tanks, to do something dramatic in space. Not just a civilian satellite, but there was an outcry to do something in a military way in space. In fact, his own chief of the Air Force, Thomas Dresser Wright, argued as early as February of 1958 that the goal of all Americans should be control of space. Absolute contradiction to the Eisenhower policy. Eisenhower stood firm. He said space should be used for peaceful purposes, period. He was hit pretty hard for sticking to that, but he held his ground. And that policy was later incorporated in the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. That's the basic space treaty. And it declares that space is the province of all mankind. They weren't politically correct in those days. They didn't say humankind. Space was the province of all mankind, should be used for peaceful purposes, etc. When it came to military matters, it said there should be no nuclear weapons or any other weapons of mass destruction in space, period. Now, nobody thought in those days, in the mid-60s, that other kinds of weapons might be possible. That's a key point to remember. So it simply banned nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in space. The Outer Space Treaty was truly the crowning achievement of Eisenhower, even though it wasn't signed until 1967. Strand number 2, precision war. The idea of precision war really grew out of World War I. As you know, at least 8 million men died in the trenches, the mud, disease, wounds, whatever. And it was a terrible, brutal thing. Machine guns, poison gas, barbed wire, shrapnel. And airplanes were used for the first time in war. In the early days, they were used simply for observation and pilots from the other side would wave at one another as they passed by in the air. A little bit later, somebody took a pistol and tried to shoot the other pilot when they passed. And then they took rifles, and they used even flechettes, little knife-like devices. They tried everything possible to knock the other pilot down. And before you know it, you had pursuit planes that were shooting down observation planes. Thousands of planes were shot down during the war. So the United States and the Brits were the leaders in developing air tactics and air thought. And before the war even ended, we being the Brits and the Americans, we had people who were talking about how to fight the next war. They figured another great and terrible war would come, and the way to fight it would be to bomb targets far behind enemy lines and force the other country to stop making war. The ability to make war would be canceled out by these strategic bombers. Some called them battle planes. So they began working on, after the war, they began working on a doctrine of strategic or selective bombing. You probably all know that. By the mid-30s, both the British and American doctrines were well developed. The idea was to have these large bombers, heavily fortified bombers, so they could shoot down fighters that were trying to attack them. And they could go far behind the lines, and they would be able to drop bombs directly onto munitions plants and rail yards and the like, and they would be dropped so accurately that civilians would be spared to a great degree. You would simply target plants and material relevant to the war, and you would leave the civilian housing and so on alone. When the war got underway, the Brits started that right away, strategic bombing, and they discovered that they couldn't defend their bombers. German fighters were knocking them down at a great rate. So they switched almost immediately to nighttime bombing, which was anything but precise. Sometimes they couldn't even find the right city. A city in Switzerland was bombed at one point by mistake. So they simply abandoned the idea of strategic bombing or precision bombing and went to area bombing, carpet bombing cities, disrupting the war production. They attempted to disrupt the war production by dehousing civilians, as they put it. The Americans, on the other hand, when they got into the war with bombers in late 1943, were still dedicated to precision bombing. They had good bomb sights and perhaps better bombers, and we did our best to hit militarily important targets. Didn't always work out that way, but after the war, the German High Command, the Air Force officers in the German High Command said, at least we tried. We went out to kill civilians. But that wasn't true in Japan. In Japan, we discovered that we couldn't even attempt to engage in precision bombing, so we just began firebombing cities. We killed more than 100,000 people in Tokyo in March, long before the atomic bombs were used, by using incendiaries. The Brits did Dresden. We helped, but we bombed during the day, but they had bombed all night before that. But the idea of precision bombing stayed with the U.S. Airmen after the war. They didn't make much progress. As you probably know, after World War II ended, there wasn't a lot of progress in military affairs, and the Korean War was fought with World War II techniques. And even the Vietnam War was fought largely with World War II techniques. And here's something that I found interesting. The men in the Army and Air Force in Vietnam, the young guys, the second lieutenants and first lieutenants, were so traumatized by that war that they began to see things in a very different kind of way. They were traumatized not only by the futility of it and the American casualties, but by the number of civilians killed in Vietnam. Horrified by it. And after the end of the Vietnam War, the American military, the Army and Air Force especially, worked on new ways of waging war, precision war, and making it truly happen. It didn't happen overnight. By the time of the Kosovo intervention, the NATO air campaign, we did have precision weapons. We had laser-guided missiles and television-guided missiles, and even a few bombs, old-fashioned dumb bombs that were guided by the GPS system. We used something like 23,000 bombs and missiles during the NATO air campaign. When I say we, I mean it was mainly the Americans. The Americans really fought that war, nobody else. And after the war, the Human Rights Watch did an on-the-ground survey. Bill Larkin was deeply involved, you know, Bill. And Human Rights Watch is not a friend of the military, exactly. And they expected to go over and find enormous civilian casualties. 23,000 bombs and missiles, you would expect that. They could only document between 489 and 528 civilian deaths due to the bombing. An amazing figure. Now, you can argue that that was the wrong war at the wrong time and so on, and that was 500 deaths too many. But still, it told the world that we'd gotten pretty good. Got that sort of thing. There's a moral component, in other words, to precision bombing. I'm not in favor of wars. I think wars are very bad ways to settle disputes. But sometimes you do have to fight. And when you do have to fight, you should do it in the most efficient way possible, meaning you should end the war quickly while sparing as many civilians as possible. You shouldn't do it the old-fashioned way where you just drop bombs everywhere and shell everybody until you kill everybody. You really need to try to fight it in a humane way. Now, that's an oxymoron to some people. War, humane, doesn't make sense. But again, if you have to fight a war, you ought to do it as humanely as possible. Strand number 3. It's called space control. Space control has its origins in control of the air during war. Again, as early as World War I, airmen began talking about the need to control the air. You had to wipe out the enemy's observation planes and pursuit planes and so on and so forth so your bombers could work. Control of the air, or air command of the air, they called it many different things, but command of the air was a popular term during that time, became the reigning paradigm, especially with the American airmen. That paradigm was refined during World War II, and it morphed directly into the space control paradigm. The idea was you had to control the highest ground possible during the war, and space is now the highest ground, so it means that you should have the capability, if conflict comes, to control space, not just the air, not just the seas, but control space. It's a very important paradigm in the military. The fourth strand is American exceptionalism. We all know about that. Certainly, places like Princeton, the northeastern United States was founded especially by people who believed that America was not only the land of opportunity, but it was a whole new way of life. It was a God-given chance to start the world anew. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Providence had led us here. We were going to leave the corrupt ways of the old world behind and start everything anew. During the 1800s especially, there was just all kinds of literature and speeches and so on about America's destiny, its manifest destiny, some called it. It was going to lead the world to something new and better. And that idea flowered in a big-time way after the Spanish-American War, when we had to decide what to do about the Philippines and so on. And the pitch then from a great number of people, including many people in Congress, was that America must become a world power and I must show people how to live, and then the Philippines would be the first example of that. I oversimplify here, but it's a very prominent strand of thought. After World War I was over, it sort of died away. People began to realize that the world was more complicated than they thought, and trying to achieve peace was a more complicated business, and so on and so forth. And the idea of American exceptionalism began to fade into the background. And I think it really stayed there until after the end of the Cold War. And when the Cold War was over, American triumphalists said, we won, and the exclamation points. Neoconservatives began to say, we have no peer competitor anymore. It's time to establish American hegemony for the good of humankind, for the good of all humankind. American hegemony would mean spreading democracy everywhere, and then there would be no more big wars, no more world wars, and so on and so forth. I don't need to say much about neoconservatives. They're kind of in disfavor right now, but they're still around. Okay, now we finally get to space. America's way of precision war is dependent largely on space assets. Observation satellites of various kinds and communication satellites, warning satellites, geodesy satellites, all kinds of satellites up there are necessary to prosecute America's way of precision war. There are some people who believe that in order to protect these assets, which are also, they link the global economy, you have to have space satellites in order for the global economy to function nowadays. The way to protect America's assets from another possible peer competitor, and you like that term, peer competitor, a lot, is to develop the ability to control space in a time of conflict. Many people I call space warriors talk about full spectrum dominance of space. Full spectrum dominance, of course, is a major part of America's military doctrine, that we should be able to achieve full spectrum dominance in any conflict, whether it's on the land or sea, in the air, or in space. The reigning idea here is that someday we're going to have a peer competitor, that somebody will challenge us, and we'd better be able to control space as well as the air and the land and so on and so forth. Since the mid-1990s, the United States government, has been churning out documents that speak of space control, space dominance, in fairly belligerent language. Our aim is to have full spectrum dominance of space by 2020. Some people say 2015. All kinds of ideas have been floated over the years for space weapons, actually weapons in space, lasers, for instance, unmanned space bombers, directed energy weapons, whatever. Rods from God, tungsten rods that could be shot down through the atmosphere and demolish a target with kinetic energy. These ideas are kind of silly. I was on 3 national task forces a few years ago, closed-door meetings, and a lot of space warriors were in those meetings, as well as people like me. And I don't think anybody was really talking seriously about these kinds of weapons anymore, because they're so expensive, they're very provocative, and they probably wouldn't work. So when somebody talks about a space laser, you can kind of dismiss that. It's just fantasy. On the other hand, what they are keen on is developing an array of anti-satellite weapons. If you want to control space, that means, in essence, that you can hit the satellites of other nations if there's a conflict. You can take them out of action, you can damage them, you can perhaps destroy them. And there are many ways of doing that. One is to smash a satellite, as the Chinese did a year ago in January, with a kinetic kill weapon. We did that in 1985, and we decided not to do it again. The reason being that you create a lot of debris in space, in orbit, and that debris stays up for many years. Depending on how high it is, it can stay up for centuries. So you don't want to do that. So we've been working on other ideas, ground-based laser that might be able to do damage to a satellite. And that idea is not very good either. It's hard to keep the optics together if you're shooting up through the atmosphere and then tracking a satellite for several minutes while you're trying to heat it up and do something to it. It's not an easy thing to do. Right now, the most common idea I call small sats, robotic small sats. Some people call them microsats. And they are little satellites that are very sophisticated, and they can be shot up, launched in the general direction of your target. Then they can take over and find the target and rendezvous with it, and even dock with it if it had a means to dock. We've conducted many experiments along these lines. We've even docked with satellites, or at least touched them, 22,000 miles over the equator. We are way ahead of everybody else in this technology. Now, we say it's perfectly benign. And the idea is we can refuel satellites in orbit and save lots of money that way. Well, nobody, or I shouldn't say nobody, but I don't think many people take that seriously. None of our multi-billion-dollar satellites have refueling capabilities. Maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we might launch satellites that could be refueled, and we could send up a service satellite to pump more fuel into them. But right now, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What does make sense is that the hard part is finding a satellite and coming close to it and maybe even touching it. The easy part is to convert this to a weapon of some kind. If you can get up close and personal with a satellite, you can do things to it. You can knock it into a useless orbit. You can drag a mylar net across it and drag it into a useless orbit. You can explode just almost a grenade-sized device next to it. And do enough damage to it that it can't function anymore, but you won't create a lot of debris. You could have a little electromagnetic pulse generator on your robotic satellite and fry its energy. You can do any number of things. And people I call space warriors are very keen on this idea. As I say, we're doing a lot of testing. DARPA, Air Force Space Command, even NASA's been working on this satellite technology. And it's something we have to be concerned about because space warriors really like the idea. You can do something to satellites of other nations, and you don't create debris as you do when you smash into a satellite. Now, why do all this? Well, because space warriors and others believe that we are going to face a peer competitor, and it's China. Since they followed the Berlin Wall, really, China's been the next great threat. And I frankly find this implausible. The Soviet Union tried to create its own system, its own economic system, its own political system, and it failed. China's learned a lot from that. The Chinese aren't into creating their own economic system, their own political system. The Chinese really want to join the world's economic system and get rich, or at least get more prosperous than they have been. The business of China was really Walmarting America. It's, I can't imagine why anybody would think that China would have an interest in taking on the United States in an arms race. But that's the idea. You don't finance big ticket items if you don't have a peer competitor either now or sometime in the future. You've got to have a peer competitor. So China's it. It's an odd situation because China, as you probably know, is helping the American economy by financing our national debt. Every year they buy a couple of $100 billion in treasuries. And that's odd behavior for a country that is intent on taking on America. They make all these products for us to sell, and yet we say, well, we've got to watch out for China. I think that's very implausible. But we're going in the direction of space control because China is going to be our enemy someday. Now, as it happens, the Chinese and Russians have been the leaders in advocating a new space treaty, a treaty that would prevent the weaponization of space. We have been very dismissive of Russian and Chinese proposals. But more than that, we've been dismissive of everybody's proposals. The UN General Assembly has been voting since 1981 to ask the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva to get going on negotiating a treaty that would prevent the weaponization of space. Every year, since 1981, the General Assembly votes on this. Every year, the United States has abstained until 2005, when we simply voted no. Over in Geneva, the idea comes up every year, and every year we use our veto power to prevent any serious talks. Now, it's a complicated issue, and it's tied up with other issues, but basically, we have said repeatedly in diplomatic circles and in other documents that, first of all, we don't believe there is an arms race in space, which has been true until a year ago, because we were the only entrant. Now that the Chinese have smashed one of their own satellites, maybe there is an arms race, at least the beginning of an arms race. And number two, we say that it's impossible to define a space weapon. And they argue that any satellite can be used as a weapon. Well, that just isn't true. They say you can take a perfectly benign science satellite, for instance, and make it smash into another satellite. Well, the physics don't work. It's very hard once you're in orbit to change position in any radical way. If you want a space weapon, you've got to design it from the ground up. So it's really kind of a cover. Number three, and the United States is very candid about this. They say we want to keep our options open. We want to be able to design anything we want to when it comes to weaponizing space. But according to our own national space policy, we don't want anybody else to do it. We want the right to do it, but we would regard anybody else as doing anything similar as hostile and impermissible. So we have simply, to use today's phrase, we have simply dissed the entire world when it comes to a new treaty. So, where do we stand? First of all, I hope the new administration might change course a little bit. A new administration might, for instance, revise our official space policy and make it less belligerent. It might say, for instance, that we will not be the first to test or introduce any kind of a space weapon. A new administration might, for instance, tell our guys in Geneva, well, let's sit down and talk. Let's see if we can do it. We are so far ahead of everybody else, years and years ahead. And we could spend 2 or 3 years talking to see whether the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and others are really serious about this. That would be a pretty important step. But I have to remind you that the policy we have now was established during the Reagan years, carried on by Bush 41, and Bill Clinton went along with this policy of no treaty, no negotiations. And now George W. Bush. So it's not just a Republican idea. The Clinton administration had ample opportunity to do something about it and didn't. So I don't have high hopes about this. I do believe that the most powerful argument you can make for a new space treaty is simply has to do with the nature of America, our founding values. We said in our founding documents, and we've generally said it ever since, that we believe in the rule of law. This is a foundational idea. Individual sovereignty, of course, but the rule of law is paramount. If we continue to refuse to sit down and negotiate seriously, or even talk seriously about a new space treaty, a treaty that the entire world says it wants, are we then acting in a lawless way? I think you can make an argument that we are. A treaty would not be easy to do. We'd have to have ironclad verification measures, and maybe the Chinese and Russians don't want to do that. They've indicated that they're pretty leery about verification. But we're not going to know, are we, until we decide to sit down and talk. We have simply said, here's what the Russians and Chinese are up to. They're China by time, or they build up their own resources, and so on and so forth. We don't know that for sure. What we do know is that no country can make much headway in developing any kind of space weapon, including anti-satellite weapons, unless it begins testing in space. And that's visible from the get-go. We would know that. So it seems to me it's possible, if people conduct negotiations in good faith, it seems to me that it's possible to sit down and work out a verification system that could work for everybody. Now, if we continue in our present path, so what? I've heard people say, well, if we have a conflict in space, let's say a dozen satellites in low Earth orbit are smashed by kinetic kill weapons, and nobody else has the capability of doing anything but kinetic kill. So what? They're just machines. But I would point out that if you smash enough satellites in low Earth orbits, you're going to very quickly ruin the use of low Earth orbits for any purpose. Almost all the satellites and space probes that are destined for higher orbits or even to Mars and beyond spend some time in low Earth orbit before they're sent on their way. If you make low Earth orbits unfit for use, and I don't know how many satellites you'd have to smash to do that, I think you're risking making space unfit for use in a very large way. And I think the consequences of that could be pretty bad. I think the global economy, which is so space dependent, could collapse. The banking system, international banking system, would certainly collapse. Everybody who relies on instant communications would be in big trouble because we're not capable of living in the 1950s again. Our technology has moved us way beyond where we can function globally without space communications. So that's a possibility. If an arms race really turned in the wrong direction, we might have a global economic collapse. Would people then die of starvation in many areas of the world? Would they die of diseases? Would there be wars over resources as things collapse? I don't know. It's kind of a worst-case scenario. Another scenario is, even if there is no conflict in space, but there is an arms race in space, you poison the intellectual atmosphere of the world to a degree. The world faces huge problems, boundary-crossing problems in this century. I don't have to do a laundry list running from global warming to rampant pathogens causing pandemics. There has to be a high degree of cooperation among the nations of the world, or we're not going to come close to solving these problems. Imagine a scenario where the United States has achieved what they believe is the capability to control space. And they say, in a time of conflict. In a time of conflict is kind of an odd way of phrasing it, because if you have these kinds of weapons, then they become coercive weapons. You know, they have power just because they exist, as nuclear weapons have power just because they exist. Space warriors say repeatedly, we would not ever use these weapons except in a time of conflict. But as good realists, we know that intentions are important, but capabilities are even more important. We may have the best intentions right now. 10 years from now, we may have the best intentions, but 20 years from now, who knows? What country could rely on the good intentions of another powerful state, a state that has demonstrated extraordinary military technology in the past, a state that has made some mistakes, invasion of Iraq, that's a huge mistake. What other power could rely on the everlasting good intentions of another state like the United States? Imagine if the Chinese had said, as we have said in many, many documents and forums, that it intended to develop the means to control space by 2020 and possibly earlier. We'd be going nuts over here. The president would be on national TV saying, this shall not stand, this insult to the world, and so on and so forth. We would demand sanctions against China, and if that failed, then we would get on with an arms race. We would get on with our own weapons. Why would any other country, powerful country, be willing to submit to U.S. plans to control space? Doesn't make sense to me. Maybe it makes sense to some of you out there. I was on a radio talk show the other day, and the woman who was interviewing said, oh, what's wrong with the United States controlling space? We're the good guys. Well, I think in many ways we are the good guys. But there's a lot wrong with entrusting your livelihood, your economic livelihood, your nation to the whims of another nation. The American experiment was about, as I said earlier, the rule of law. I think we should pursue that on an international basis. And I think developing a new treaty, or attempting to develop a new treaty, is the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do, it's the ethical thing to do, and it's the pragmatic thing to do. There are more than 800 satellites up there. More than 40 nations have satellites. More than half of those are American. In a way, we have the most to lose from an arms race in space, because if it ever gets out of hand and anti-satellite weapons start firing, we have more targets than anybody else. So, a treaty is the way to go. We should attempt it. It's consistent with Americans' founding values. It's consistent with what's needed today in global cooperation. And I hope we all do our best to try to get this idea across to the new president, the new Congress, to editorial writers, and everybody who will listen to you spout off. I enjoy answering questions, and I hope you have a lot of questions. So fire away. Okay.
Maybe I'll start if somebody else doesn't want to jump in. The Chinese recently tabled a treaty, I think, a draft treaty in Geneva. And one of the things that I don't understand about it is it talks about space weapons, but attacking space objects. But anything you can do from space, you can also do from the ground. And so, don't you want to also ban attacks from the ground?
I'm glad you asked that question. I almost did a plant. As it happens, I testified at the UN about a week ago, and the Chinese ambassador said, well, we had just introduced this new space treaty, Mr. Moore, and what do you think of it? I said, well, it's a start. But that's all it is. It's a start because it doesn't really fit the realities of what we're up against. It talks about shooters in space, weapons in space. And again, I don't think the Americans are talking about shooters in space anymore, except in kind of when they're in a dreamlike trance-like state. What they are talking about are ground-based weapons, sea-based weapons, air-based weapons that can hit targets in space. And a treaty has to deal with those kinds of weapons or potential weapons. And here's where we get to the really hard part. The National Missile Defense System can be regarded as a anti-satellite system in disguise. The infrastructure needed for the National Missile Defense System is almost precisely what you need for an anti-satellite system. So under the guise of defense, we are working on a system that is very good for hitting satellites. Now, the kinds of interceptors we have for the mid-course portion of the system can smash a satellite quite easily. But again, we don't want to smash a satellite to make debris. What we are talking about, again, is a more sophisticated system where you could possibly devise an interceptor that could retrofire at the right point and hit a satellite gently, let's say, and bump it or drag it or something like that. But in order to have a space treaty that really works, you're going to have to somehow persuade the United States to give up its national missile defense system. I don't know of anybody in the space field who regards anything, I don't know of anybody who thinks, like me, to put it differently, who thinks that the national missile defense system is anything like a liability. It probably, almost certainly would not work if ever needed, but it is a potential ASAT system. Space wars admit this. Don Rumsfeld's Space Commission said it quite pointedly. So we've got to deal with that. So the Chinese and Russian proposal was almost a non-starter. They've also hinted in Geneva that they would be very leery of intrusive verification, and that would be a non-starter too. Okay. Yeah. As I think you know, we shot down a spy satellite of our own on, I guess, the 20th, 21st, something like that. This satellite, and the true nature of it is unknown. It was maybe a new generation spy satellite, maybe a combination of radar and optical. We in the unclassified world don't know exactly what it was, but it was launched in December of 2006. It achieved orbit probably around 300 miles above the Earth. And then we lost communications with it. Now, satellites in low Earth orbit all come down. How long they stay in orbit depends on how high they are. The closer they are to the Earth, the more likely they are to come down soon. And the only way they can stay up is to get a little power boost from time to time from onboard motors. And the standard has been a tank filled with hydrazine gas in a frozen state. And this hydrazine gas is the propellant. So when you need to give your satellite a little boost or change course a little bit, you fire a little bit of propellant and it stays up there. And sooner or later, that hydrazine gas is pretty well used up. Now, the common technique is to leave enough hydrogen gas in the tank so you can bring it down in a controlled manner. The United States has dumped many, many, many satellites into the South Pacific in a controlled manner. The idea being that if you control it, you're not going to risk anybody's lives. You're going to bring it down into the water, and unless there's a sailboat right there, you're okay. Most of it will burn up, of course, before it hits, but some of the bigger chunks are going to come down. Now, since US 193 couldn't be controlled, no communications, they knew it was going to come down, but they didn't know precisely when, but more importantly, where. They knew that most of it was going to burn up, as satellites do, but not all of it was going to burn up. The hydrogen fuel tank, which was a tough little spherical thing about this big, I guess, maybe bigger, had about 1,000 pounds of frozen hydrazine in it. We do know that when the Space Shuttle Columbia came down, the hydrazine tank landed intact in a forest, I think in Texas. So we knew there was a probability that this tank would come down intact. Hydrazine is a dangerous chemical, much like ammonia. Because it was frozen, it was widely believed that it would not burn off or explode. The fact that it was frozen would keep it cool enough that it could hit the ground. So you have to ask yourself, first, it's an uncontrolled re-entry, so we don't know where it's going to go. What are the probabilities that it might hit someone or something and do some damage and maybe even kill people? Because, first of all, the Earth is about 70% water, so it's likely to fall into the water, but not necessarily. If it fell on land, where? Might fall in a desert, might fall in farm fields, might fall in the mountains somewhere and not do any damage. And the people concerned with space issues were just sending emails all the time about probabilities. The probabilities were so remote that anybody would be damaged, that we should just let it come down on its own, let it burn up, and the hydrogen tank would go wherever. I disagree with that. I think the George W. Bush administration did the right thing to smash it. And I'm very lonely in the people I deal with. Everybody else in my field, which we call space sanctuary, thinks it was a secret ASAT test or a sneaky Pete ASAT test, and then it was all done in a devious kind of way, and besides, nobody would have been hurt. But there was a non-zero probability that somebody might be hurt. There was a non-zero probability that it would fall on it might have fallen on a schoolhouse in China, or a concert hall in Paris, or, who knows? There's just no way of telling exactly when it was going to re-enter and where it was going to go. And as long as we had a remedy, as long as we could smash it in space, I believe it was the proper and moral thing to do. I've been in trouble with some of my friends ever since on that point. So what we did, we used a sea-based anti-ballistic missile system that had never been tested in an anti-satellite mode, and we smashed it right before re-entry, and we apparently hit it right on target, and the pieces of debris have been coming down ever since then. It'll take another month or more before everything comes down, but it's all going to come down. Probably nothing's going to hit the Earth. I think it's the proper thing to do. My colleagues say, it's an anti-satellite test, and it really screws things up. How can we talk about how debris-causing tests are bad if we've done it ourselves? Well, that doesn't really fit, because this debris is going to come down. It's not going to stay in orbit. Besides, everybody who cares about these things knows we have an anti-satellite capability right now. We tested it officially in 1985, and we have mid-course interceptors now. So I don't think it did any damage to international diplomacy. The Chinese and the Russians have been huffing and puffing about it, but that's no big deal. That's just normal posturing. So I agree with George W. Bush for the first time in history.
Satellite communication is pretty much done remotely, so So depending on how the antenna is built and pointed, and if it has like a wide range signal, or if it's more
very narrow.
But even though, would it be easier to just come up with a marking system between the 3D signatories of the satellite or space?
Well, space warriors are right when they say you can't really necessarily tell the purpose of a satellite once it's up. Now, to some degree, you can. If somebody orbits a satellite that's going to be close to something you're orbiting, you can guess, well, maybe there's some bad intentions there. But in my opinion, the only way you're going to be able to ensure that somebody's not putting up anti-satellite weapons is to have close, on-the-ground, highly intrusive inspection. And I don't think any other system is going to work in the end. And some of my friends just... Before launch. That's a very difficult thing because people in the commercial satellite business have proprietary secrets, and of course our own NRO has their own secrets, and then you've got to have a real paradigm shift about this before you can do highly intrusive inspections. But I think it's time for a paradigm shift. I mean, we have left I hope the era of major great power wars behind. We do have a global economy now, and it staggers me to think that we have people who still think the Chinese are going to militarily challenge us, or we're going to challenge we are challenging the Chinese, or the Russians are going to go after us, or the Indians. The Indians are one of the newest bad guy nations in terms of space. There's a lot of whispering about what the Indians are up to, and I think that's just silly. It's time to get on with global cooperation in space. Again, space is according to the international law, the province of all mankind. The United States has a very sophisticated method of tracking satellites in space. It's called situational awareness. We'd like to know what the situation is. But it's not really good enough to keep track of everything all the time. But you can imagine if there's a paradigm shift of some kind, that we could work with other spacefaring nations and develop an international space monitoring system so that we know where every satellite is at every given moment. It's not that hard. It just requires, from a technical standpoint, it's not that hard. It just requires that you abandon the ideas of competition and secrecy and get on with working together and accepting space as the province of all mankind. Don't hold your breath.
I agree with what you said, but I'm concerned about the fact that treaties are not laws. Treaties are covenants in which two parties agree to some act or some agreement.
Yeah.
Do you think that we could put much trust into treaties?
I think some treaties and conventions are better than others. Chemical weapons, for instance, can be done anywhere. Biological weapons, I think, can be done anywhere. Even when it gets to nuclear weapons, then you get into the realm of, well, it's pretty hard to disguise a real nuclear weapons program, especially if any testing is involved. But when it comes to space, it's an altogether different ballgame. Donald Rumsfeld chaired a commission that met in 2000, commonly called the Space Commission, and he drafted, I'm told he drafted the Space Pearl Harbor language himself, that we could face a Space Pearl Harbor, which meant that many satellites, U.S. satellites, would be attacked simultaneously, and we would lose our eyes and ears and a whole bit. Well, not even the United States has that kind of capability. Maybe it could develop it some years down the road, but the fact is, and when you get behind closed doors, people will admit this, you can't develop an anti-satellite capability that you can depend on without testing in space. And here's the deal. If somebody starts testing in space, you know what's going on. And so the treaty would be different in that respect. Violations would be immediately apparent. And it just really isn't possible to do lab work and then all of a sudden have 50 weapons ready to go. It just isn't possible. So I have confidence that a treaty could work. The idea is to sit down and try to determine whether China and Russia and India and the United States want it to work. Everybody else really wants to. The European Union is very much in favor of a treaty. Canada's been pushing for a treaty for a long time. The Brits are for a treaty. The only bad guys are the Chinese and Russians and us. We're forming a new axis. Yeah.
The largest satellite up there, of course, is the International Space Station.
Yeah.
Wouldn't the international cooperation on that tend to argue for the case that cooperation in space is progressing and that we are making progress?
I think that's a good point. We do have some real cooperation there. The ISS was promoted in the beginning really as a way to help out the Russians and, give their space scientists something to do. Doesn't do any real science, but at least it does operate in a spirit of cooperation. The Chinese are not a part of it yet, and we've been sort of blocking that. But when it comes to military affairs, then people turn very secretive. The International Space Station is completely transparent. I mean, everybody knows what everybody's doing. When it comes to military things, it's not true. Again, I talk about a paradigm shift. I sound like Thomas Kuhn here. Paradigm shift, that's all we need. Now, that's the most difficult thing to achieve. But if we're going to preserve space for human use for many, many years, if not forever, we've got to think of it differently and work with the Chinese, work with the Russians, and so on. We're not doing that on military issues yet, or not many military issues. See?
Mike, what are the lessons that you learn about space from the problem of controlling the use of military force in the oceans? Because one could argue that 100 years ago, the world's economy depended on shipping.
Yeah.
And the invention of submarines and the deliberate attack on shipping, which was part of military strategy during World War I and again during World War II, and the invention of the submarine and all those kinds of things, which we have failed to control.
Mm-hmm.
What are the lessons to be learned from that experience, and how does it map onto this business of space? Because it seems most countries have learned to live with the fact that even though the world depends on this, navies are navies.
Well, I'll go back a little bit. Tens of thousands of years. Conflict on land is as old as human civilization. Conflict on the seas goes back thousands of years. Conflict in the air goes back actually before World War I. So the argument made by space warriors is that we should not expect anything different from space. And I tend to argue that space is a whole new thing. In the past, nobody really gave systematic thought to preventing land. Well, sure, people have talked about treaties forever, but conflict on land was just established, conflict on the seas was established, conflict on the air was established, but since the early 80s, governments of the nations of the world have argued that space is different, that we should try to prevent conflict there. Now, what do we learn from our experience on the seas? I guess it has to do with something almost philosophical. If you're talking about the seas, you're talking about something mundane, earthbound, generally, you know where Navy ships are. We know where submarines are. We have ways of knowing where, for a long time, have had ways to know where the Soviet submarines are, and now Russian submarines, and Chinese submarines, and we know where everything is, and there's kind of a well-established pattern of kind of doing something slightly provocative here and backing off and so on and so forth. There's no pattern regarding space. The pattern is yet to be designed and cut. I don't know what we can learn from patterns established on Earth, but I do think the human mind is capable of establishing and cutting new patterns for space. I'm not sure that's really answering your question, because I don't like analogies to the sea. Space warriors talk sea analogies all the time. They talk about the great commons of the sea, and space is just like the great commons of the sea, and we've learned to live with navies and submarines and whatnot, and we can learn to live with the same thing in space. I just don't think so. I look up at the stars on a clear night, and I'm just overwhelmed. Now, I know when we talk about orbital space, we're really talking about just this little thin belt around the Earth, but still, I think there is something different about space. And we've got to design those new patterns and cut them out and apply them. So I'm sorry, Zia, maybe we can talk later about it. But
Thanks very much. How serious is the debris problem? That's the fundamental difference between the kind of space war that Russia and China could conduct now, where they blast that satellite on the sky but make a mess, and the kind of war that you would want to prevent through this kind of treaty.
Well, the debris problem is not terribly serious yet. We're tracking about, last I heard, about 12,600 pieces of debris, roughly the size of my fist or bigger. Anything that big can cause terrible damage or total destruction to an object in space if they're on a collision course. I mean, you're talking about the possibilities of collision courses at 22,000 miles an hour or 25,000 miles an hour. On the other hand, you can collide with something at 1 mile an hour too, just depending on direction and orbit and so on and so forth. We meaning all spacefaring nations, have to dodge debris from time to time. It uses up fuel to change a satellite's orbit ever so slightly so that you minimize the risk of collision. The International Space Station does that fairly often. I've tried to get a handle, I've talked to physicists, tried to get a handle on what would happen if a lot of satellites were smashed in space. And the only answer I get is, well, it's going to create huge problems depending on how many are smashed, and nobody can put a figure to it. But if we had to dodge in low Earth orbits 100,000 pieces of debris this big instead of 12,600, it might become very, very difficult to do it. It might even be impossible. Also, you have to remember that a piece of debris the size of a marble, if your collision speed is fast enough, can do a lot of damage. So the answer is it would probably do a lot of harm to have a lot of debris up there, but we don't know what the tipping point might be. The United States does have the capability of bypassing low Earth orbit if it needs to get something into higher orbits. I think we probably are the only state that can reliably do that, but it's much more expensive and more difficult to do it. But maybe the United States could survive in a high debris environment better than other spacefaring states. But it's a question without a good answer yet. A lot of these don't have good answers yet.
It seems to me that you described I guess it's the Chinese, that's the Russian-Chinese bill.
Yeah, it's a joint effort.
As pretty under developed. it does sound like you could use an independent group to design such a treaty. And it does sound like a very interesting challenge that you described.
Well, the Chinese-Russian draft treaty is hugely underdeveloped, and I think for a reason. Both the Russians and Chinese know that there'd be no possibility to get the United States involved in any kind of talks if they were talking about ground-based systems right off the bat. They presented it almost as a talking paper more than anything else. So the easiest thing to negotiate is let's not have shooters in space. Even the Americans might go along with that at some point because we have all these ground-based capabilities. So I think the Chinese and Russians just want to break the deadlock and get us to sit down and talk. Where it would go from there, I don't know. It would depend on who's president, in part.
What do you think the chances might be for the next administration? Should be willing to fight for it?
I don't think the chances that the next administration are going to deal with this issue are very good because it's not a high priority issue with the American people. Iraq is a huge issue, and the economy is a huge issue, and so on and so forth. But my wife Sandy was pointing out something the other day when I was holding my hands in despair. I'm in favor of Obama. I hate to say that, but I am. But John McCain may be our next president. And I thought, gosh, that would be terrible. He's a military hardliner. And she pointed out, well, maybe it takes that kind of a person to deal with these military issues. Kind of like it took a Nixon to go to China. So maybe McCain would be more amenable or could do something. But it is not a high priority issue. It's not going to be a high priority issue until some president says our official policy is space dominance. Right now, it's not official policy. We're drifting that way. The documents presented by Air Force Space Command and others are very inflammatory, but it is not quite yet national policy to do it. I think Don Rumsfeld, and a lot of people think this, came back into office in 2001 precisely to get us involved in space. I knew him slightly in Chicago, and as early as 1998, at a Council on Foreign Relations meeting in Chicago, I realized this guy really wants weapons in space. And he was appointed chairman of the Space Commission, and the Space Commission report, which you can find. You can just go to Google, put in Space Commission in quotation marks, and you're going to find it. And it says that this should be an option for the United States to have weapons in space and so on and so forth. I think if it hadn't been for 9/11, we'd be far down that road because that was his mission. I talked to somebody who worked with the Joint Chiefs off the record, and he said they were all sure that he wanted to be Defense Secretary to be an agent of transformation, and part of his transformation was going to be space. So that's been delayed. It's been pushed back a few years.